King Belshazzar gave a great banquet for 1,000 of his nobles, and drank wine with them. While Belshazzar was drinking his wine, he gave orders to bring in the gold and silver goblets that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken from the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, might drink from them. So they brought in the gold goblets that had been taken from the temple of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines drank from them. As they drank the wine, they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Suddenly, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall, near the lampstand in the royal palace. The king watched the hand as it wrote. His face turned pale, and he was so frightened that his legs became weak and his knees were knocking. The king summoned the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. Then he said to these wise men of Babylon, "Whoever reads this writing and tells me what it means will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed round his neck, and he will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king what it meant. So King Belshazzar became even more terrified, and his face grew more pale. His nobles were baffled. The queen, hearing the voices of the king and his nobles, came into the banquet hall. "May the king live forever," she said. "Don't be alarmed. Don't look so pale. There is a man in your kingdom who has the spirit of the holy gods in him. In the time of your father, he was found to have insight and intelligence and wisdom like that of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, appointed him chief of the magicians, enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. He did this because Daniel, whom the king called Belshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve difficult problems. Call for Daniel, and he will tell you what the writing means." So Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel, one of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah? I have heard that the spirit of the gods is in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom. The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it. Now I have heard that you are able to give interpretations and to solve difficult problems. If you can read this writing and tell me what it means, you will be clothed in purple and have a gold chain placed round your neck, and you will be made the third highest ruler in the kingdom." Then Daniel answered the king, "You may keep your gifts for yourself and give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing for the king and tell him what it means. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendor. Because of the high position he gave him, all of the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, and he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory, he was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you have set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, Your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honor the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore, he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. This is the inscription that was written: Mene, Mene, Tekel, Parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene. God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel. You have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then, at Belshazzar's command, Daniel was clothed in purple. A gold chain was placed round his neck, and he was proclaimed the third highest ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Babylonians, was slain, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62.
Good morning, friends. How I would like to be like my grandfather. I tell you, he was something else. He died some years ago now and left my grandmother a widow, and she was a practical, determined lady. She was pretty savvy when it came to reading situations and dealing with people, and particularly good at giving other people advice. You know the sort. Listen to me, you're just wrong. But it was pretty tough for her after my granddad died. I'd have to admit it was tough for me too. I admired him tremendously. In many ways I'd like to be just like him. I miss him. So did a lot of people who knew him. He was an ideas man, my grandfather, and he could make his ideas happen. He wasn't just a talker, he was an action man who got things done. A bit of an autocrat, hardly a collaborative leader. He didn't let anyone else get in his way. Narcissistic? Yeah, I guess that label fits. He was a mover and a shaker. You've probably heard of him. His name was Nebuchadnezzar. He was enormously, almost unbelievably clever and creative and powerful. Powerful, glorious, splendid and frightening. He really knew how to deal with people. And I mean deal with people. All the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. He was a machine, my grandfather, the ultimate governing and ruling machine. Nebuchadnezzar promised to make Babylon great again, and he did it. He was like a raging, unassailable, majestic lion, the main man, you might say. He swallowed up other little nations like a ravenous predator. Maybe that's why we've adopted the lion as our symbol in Babylon, the insatiable lion. Babylon the Great, Babylon the Magnificent. Here's my new motto, do you like it? Belshazzar's Babylon. Brilliant, beautiful, brash, bold, and brutal. He was an architect, an engineer, a planner, a visionary, all wrapped up in a package of furious strength and unimaginable authority. His palace beside the Euphrates River had the most spectacular rooftop hanging gardens. He'd built them especially to make his wife, my grandmother, feel more at home after she moved from her country's home into the great city. No wonder the entire population fell down and worshipped his gargantuan statue. 27 metres high it was. He's like a god. And if anyone was in any doubt about that, I guess the threat of being thrown into a fiery furnace might have assisted them to make up their minds. But you know, much as I admired him, and much as many others admired him, and even worshipped him, I have to say, he had a flaw in his personality. Actually, a fatal flaw. He was incredibly powerful and successful, impregnable, like me. Although, unlike me, he wasn't quite impregnable. Nebuchadnezzar had a chink in his armour, you might say. In fact, he had 2 chinks in his armour. 2 shortcomings. 2 serious weaknesses. Not just one. His first flaw was one of those things people don't like to talk about, especially successful people and leaders. One of those little peccadilloes that we like to sweep under the carpet and not make public. It was a bit of an embarrassment to the family. As you can imagine, he had a bit of a mental health challenge, a tendency, in fact quite a strong tendency, to a pretty bizarre mental illness. For 7 years, he just went into some kind of mental fog. He was on another planet. Absolutely insane and completely delusional. He admitted it later himself. Off with the fairies. You should have seen the awful, vacant, wild, hollow look in his eyes. It wasn't human at all. But it wasn't just his mind that went. You wouldn't believe this. He more or less turned into some kind of an animal. That beast of a man turned into a beast. People talk sometimes about legends of incarnation, when one of the gods becomes a man. Well, this was a bit like that. A man who became an animal. Just bizarre. His hair grew long and lush like the feathers of an eagle, except that it was thick and tangled and greasy and gross, full of filth and burrs and seeds and sticks. His fingernails and toenails became longer and sharper and filthier until they looked like the long, sharp talons of a bird, like a vulture. He stopped eating proper food and started roaming around on all fours through the royal farms, munching the grass all day long. When his family tried to talk to him, all they got was a snarl and a mmm. And manky. It's an understatement. You could smell him from the opposite end of the corridor. You had to watch your step. He left steaming man-pats on the ground, all over the place. Then he left his bedroom altogether and went to sleep outside with the animals. Even when he was finally thrown out of the palace, he didn't seem to mind. Off he went, salivating like a dog, dribbling at the mouth. Was he possessed by some evil spirit? I don't know. He actually thought he was a bull. If physicians or medical people in the future investigate this sort of thing, perhaps they'd give it a name like monomania, a weird, obsessive, pathological preoccupation with one thing. Holy cow. And amidst all these strange goings-on, one of the most extraordinary things of all was that an Israelite captive named Daniel predicted all this before it happened. My grandfather renamed Daniel Belshazzar, named after our Babylonian god, Bel, because his Hebrew name, Daniel, means God is my judge, and I think Nebuchadnezzar was a bit uncomfortable about that. Bit of a poke in the eye. But I still prefer to call him Daniel because Belshazzar sounds too much like my name, Belshazzar. Anyway, Daniel was a high-ranking, high-achieving public servant under Nebuchadnezzar, and he'd predicted that exactly this would happen after the king had told him about a disturbing dream that he'd had. Now, you know as well as I do what a lame bunch of losers those Israelites are. Quirky, displaced, self-flagellating refugees who persist decade after decade with that pathetic Yahweh, the God of Israel stuff. A make-believe God who's so powerless he can't even lift a finger to help his stupid, conquered people. They're still going on with that decades later. What has that God ever done for them? But I've got to say this Daniel was something else. And he was even spot on with the timing. 7 years to the day he said it would be, that the king's mind would turn into the mind of an animal. And so it was, right on 7 years until he stopped his absurd behaviour and stopped eating grass, cut his hair, had a serious manicure and pedicure, got dressed, that was a mercy, put his brain back into gear and started ruling once again. Well, That was Nebuchadnezzar's first fatal flaw, mental illness. Man, I'm glad it doesn't run in the family. It took 7 years, 7 long years, gone, whooshka, just like that. But at last he finally got over it, pulled himself together and became great again. But his second problem, the other one I said I'd tell you about, was even worse in a way. More destructive, for a mighty king, even more shameful, if that were possible. His second fatal flaw was this. Despite all his power and magnificence, he was a weakling. He often had trouble sleeping, complained of nightmares, and one night he had a dream that really rattled him about an enormous tree that reached to the sky and was full enough of food to provide for every human and every animal in the kingdom. Then some messenger of the gods came down, cut the tree down, left just a stump, but in that strange way that things get mixed up in dreams, the stump was a man and it turned out to be Nebuchadnezzar himself, and he, the stump man, was sent away from civilization and lived like a wild, mindless animal for 7 years. Now, at that point, Nebuchadnezzar made a bad call. That was when he asked Daniel to interpret the dream for him, and Daniel said he was going to lose his kingdom and half turn into a wild animal. I think silver-tongued Daniel was so persuasive that the king talked himself into it and slowly went mad. 12 months later, he put himself out to pasture. But worse than that, when he regained his senses after 7 years, he capitulated to Daniel's pathetic Israelite God, Yahweh. He must have been so worried about going mad again that he hedged his bets and praised Daniel's God. What a weakling. What a spineless, puny response. As if that weak God of Israel had caused his mental illness and then restored him and given him his greatness and glory back. Apparently the king said, God does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the peoples of the earth. As if that God controls human history. Humans control history, not some invisible God. Nebuchadnezzar even went so far as to call him the King of Heaven. You know, I think he actually believed in that God and gave glory to him and took on some attitude of humility. He thought the Israelite God was sovereign over all the kingdoms of the earth. What an embarrassment for Babylon. What a coward. What an admission of impotence. It makes me so angry when I think about it. The great king with the fatal flaw. But never mind. That was all a long time ago. Fortunately, we've moved on. No God-fearers here. Now Babylon is proud and great once again, invincible under my impeccable leadership. Magnificent Babylon. I decided to put on a great feast. If there's something we really know how to do well in Babylon, apart from conquering the world, it's celebrating with food and feasting. My army of kitchen slaves has been working for weeks to prepare the food and the decorations. You should have seen my palace banqueting hall earlier this evening. What a spectacle. What a night. 1,000 of my nobles, all my wives, my entourage of concubines, all their place settings sparkling and gleaming in the radiant glow of the massive, ornate royal lampstand, reflected off the shimmering, glossy plaster of the walls, and all of them eating the exquisite, choicest produce of the finest kingdom in the world, alcohol flowing like rivers until they could drink no more. While I was downing my first cup of wine, a truly ingenious thought suddenly occurred to me. Pottery cups are all right, but I love drinking from gold, don't you? Gold's the real thing. Things go better with gold. It was a touch of novelty too. So I called some servants and commanded them to run off and fetch the golden goblets that my grandfather had brazenly taken from the God temple in Jerusalem all those years ago. The top products of those legendary, skilled Israelite goldsmiths of days gone by. The gold cups looked superb on our tables. They really set off the gleaming plates and cutlery. But it was more than just aesthetics I was on about. We were making a statement. As my nobles, my wives, my concubines and I lifted those sacred Israelite God vessels to our lips and toasted the fine idols all around the walls of the banquet hall, we drank to our Babylonian gods. Our gods made of silver, iron and wood and stone, and gods of gold. You get my point? If you arrive at your office one morning and find that your desk, your chair, your scroll cabinet, your writing tablet, your stylus, your papyrus wall hanging, and your little household idols are all in a pile in the colonnade outside your office door, you know what's going on, don't you? It's not that your stuff is out. You're out. You're gone. See you later. And that's exactly what I wanted to get across. You show contempt for the stuff from that Israelite God's temple, you're showing contempt for that God himself. That was my point. Up your nose with a rubber hose, Yahweh of Israel. The sweet taste of lavish blasphemy as we gloried in our contempt of that powerless, mean-spirited, invisible God of the Israelites. Gold. Only the best is good enough for Babylon, and the best only just. Imagine if there was some way of sending images of all that magnificent cuisine. Maybe in some future age when Babylon is even greater. Imagine if images could somehow be sent instantly through the whole world to make known the richness of our kingdom and the splendour of my achievements, to impress our allies, to tantalise and demoralise our enemies. It's just one of my little flights of fancy, but it's not such a bad idea, is it? Perhaps I should get my magicians and enchanters onto that one. Well, there we were earlier tonight, having a raucous, rambunctious celebration, when suddenly the strangest thing happened. The weirdest thing I have ever seen in my life. Every eye in that palace hall saw it at the same moment. Something that looked like a human hand just appeared and started writing on the plaster of the palace wall. Everyone stopped drinking, even the nobles who were already sloshed. That mysterious, determined hand went on and on, slowly and carefully writing. It was bizarre. Clearly the hand was writing letters and words, but nobody could work out what they meant. I called in my trusty bunch of astrologers and magicians, but they were typically useless, charlatans. They couldn't even read it, let alone tell me what it meant. Of course, I could tell it had something to do with money. Miners, shekels, half shekels. It's just that I'd put away a few goblets of wine and I wasn't thinking quite as quickly as I usually do. It was a bit of a ruckus. People were shouting. I wasn't scared, of course, although I could see some of the nervous Nellies around me were having trouble staying on their feet. Some were even having trouble keeping their meal down. And then in came Madam herself, the Queen Mother, the old battle axe. But she's a straight talker, I have to give her that. And sometimes she comes out with random advice which is occasionally worth listening to. She said, "May the king live forever, blah, blah, blah. What you need, boy, is that old Israelite bloke, Daniel. Clever one your grandfather used to call on to solve his enigmas when he got edgy, remember? The one who could tell people what their dreams meant. Why don't you give him a go? You look like you could use some help." I found that rather offhand and humiliating. Daniel this, Daniel that. But I thought, well, Nebuchadnezzar swore by Daniel, and if he really does have the spirit of the gods in him, that might just be worth a try. And apparently he's a vegetarian for what that's worth. So I had Daniel wheeled out. Daniel the dinosaur, to be frank. He's in his 80s now, you know. And I told him I'd reward him if he could produce the goods. The hand, the conjuring trick, had stopped by that time and vanished. and Daniel walked straight through the quivering crowd. I couldn't say Daniel's arrogant exactly, but he's so infuriatingly confident, as if he has nothing to fear from me. He took a good look at the writing, turned around and opened his mouth to speak. One of my PAs had his clay tablet and stylus there with him, so I told him to pull himself together and take a verbatim record of the speech. Daniel. How pathetic. Little old man, displaced person, fanciful delusions of his feeble, powerless Israelite God. Listen to what Daniel said as he shook his elderly, grizzled jowls at me in a gesture of grand defiance. Your Majesty, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar sovereignty and greatness and glory and splendour. Because of the high position he gave him, all the nations and peoples of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled. But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was deposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory. He was driven away from people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like the ox, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and sets over them anyone he wishes. But you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled yourself, though you knew all this. Instead, you've set yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You had the goblets from his temple brought to you, and you and your nobles, your wives and your concubines drank wine from them. You praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood and stone, which cannot see or hear or understand. But you did not honour the God who holds in his hand your life and all your ways. Therefore he sent the hand that wrote the inscription. Are you joking, Daniel? I, Belshazzar, humble myself before Israel's God? He was suggesting I repent, for goodness sake. That I repent like my mighty but weak-willed grandfather did. What is this? What kind of moronic, pig-headed, suicidal arrogance would dare to speak like that against me and the great gods Bel and Marduk and all my other gods of silver and gold? Stirrer. Still, I gave Daniel a promotion and a bit of gold bling to dangle around his sinewy old neck to shut him up. But listen to this, the so-called interpretation of the words the hand had inscribed on the palace wall. This is what Daniel, that fearless old rogue, fabricated and claimed his God had sent to me. Mene, mene, tekel, parsin. Here is what these words mean. Mene, God has numbered the days of your reign and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Peres, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. I think Daniel thought that Persians, Peres, Parsin would make a nice bit of wordplay. Why would Daniel even think it could do any good to speak about his lame God to a hostile, all-powerful ruler and his government? What effect could Daniel or anyone hope to have on me and my government and the tide of human history? It's like standing in the Euphrates River and telling it to dry up. Babylon and Belshazzar, winners. Daniel and his shrill, piping, complaining God, losers. As if I would lose my nerve and cave in like my anxious grandfather Nebuchadnezzar did when the going got tough. What a nonsense for those Yahweh God worshippers to think they have anything relevant to say to modern society, or that anyone would be interested to listen. They're stuck in the past. Why won't they just shut up and realise we live in a modern society, a brave new age where the culture has changed and we have moved on from what God might think? Daniel and God, I don't give a toss about you. I know better than you do about real power, about kingdoms that last forever, about life and death and life after death. I know better than you do about love and sex, about gender and marriage, about the economy. Just look at Babylon. I know better than you about border security, about science, about military superiority, about making money, about trampling on the weak, and how to treat refugees and displaced people like those tedious Israelites. Look around at my eternal city. Look at Babylon. Touch it, feel it, breathe it in, taste its food, smell its spices. We live in the real world, not the invisible imagination of Daniel and his God. Nothing stands against Babylon and Belshazzar. No prophet, no foreign god, no mental illness, no armies, nothing. Babylon will prevail. We'll choose our gods, or no gods at all if we want. There is nothing like my kingdom, and there never will be, because it will last 1,000 years. If you're into symbolism, my Babylon would be the perfect image for the pinnacle of human power and pride and prosperity, luxury and opulence. Listen to that captive Daniel and his dreamed up fantasies. Listen to this so-called living God who writes obscure secret messages and thinks he knows better than I do. Listen to this cowardly, invisible God who exposes merely his hand but would never dare to show more of himself than that to the world. You can't even make idols of him because no one knows what he's supposed to look like. Ha! God, I dare you to show yourself, to be real and tangible like Babylon, so humans can actually see you, touch you, talk to you, hear you, ask you real questions and argue with you. If you ever showed yourself to us, you'd realise how powerful we humans really are. We'd demolish you. Don't you give me an ultimatum. Doesn't that feeble Israelite God realise that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me? Is he serious? I, Belshazzar, the all-powerful, magnificent ruler of the mightiest nation on earth, the king of all the earth, in fact, acknowledge God and take notice of him? Bow down and worship him like my weak and flabby grandfather did? Over my dead body.